All right, so today we begin a new chapter, chapter 11, and this chapter it can be found on our website at jewisharcadia.com/7890. Pretty easy to remember. 7890 is the extension of our website link. And the topic of chapter 11 is the topic of the Rosh V'Tovlai and the Rosh V'Ralei, which is difficult to translate because Russia typically um, is translated as an evil person or a wicked person. But that's not who we're talking about because, as the Tanya describes, Russia is not something that somebody necessarily behaves in a way of a Russia, but we're talking about something where a person is capable of behaving as a Russia. In other words, if somebody even thinks about sin or or speaks about sin or maybe even does a sin or either any one of those combinations, and even if it's extremely infrequently, they're still in the category of a Russia. Now there's different gradations of a Russia, and that's what we're going to talk about. But unless you're literally at all times worshiping God and doing everything for God in every single circumstance of your life, um, you're welcome to the club of Rishayim. So, is that an evil person? Well, that's what we're saying. That it's a Russia of a Tavle. There's a Russia who good is to him, and Russia Varale, Russia that evil is to him. So that this chapter will explain what is a Russia of a Tavle, what's the lowest level within the category of Russia of a Tavle, and again, just like with the tzaddik levels, there's a whole broad um, what's it called? Like a sliding scale of different levels. And then there's also the level of a Russia Virale as well. So it's interesting that over here we talk about a Russia. And if you think of the number 11, especially chapter 11, so in finances, chapter 11 is not a very good thing. And the number 11 in Judaism is not usually the most significant number. You think about what's a Jewish number. Seven is a Jewish number, the day of Shabbos. Three is a chazaka. It's a trio. It's a
Sorry.
strong number. The number 10 is complete. Chai is 18. There's a lot of very Jewish numbers. Four are the mothers, three are the fathers, two are the tablets, right? As the song goes. When it comes to 11, there isn't something about the number 11 that's really prevalent in our everyday lives. In fact, when we sing the song about the number 11, we mention the stars in Joseph's dream. Okay, so the stars in Joseph's dream are 11 stars. Now, most days, our name is not Joseph, and we're not recording our dreams. So the number 11 um, actually has a specific connection with the Russia. You see, there was one service in the temple which was called the Ketoret. Ketoret means the incense. And the incense, as we read in our daily prayers, because the prayers are supposed to replace the sacrifices and the incense, we read in our daily prayers that the incense contained the following 11 kinds of spices: balm, and you know what, I'm not even going to try to read all of them because I haven't encountered most of these things like frankincense, myrrh, saffron, and other things, cinnamon. There's a whole series of 11 different spices. Now, one of those spices happens to be a very pungent and unpleasant spice. And the rule is that if somebody were to bring the incense upon the altar, 11 minus 1, missing even one ingredient, it says that they would die by the hands of heaven. Meaning, this was a grave violation of God's pleasure-seeking exercise of having the ketoret, of having this incense be brought to him. And from this, the Talmud learns that if there's a fast day, meaning a fast day to observe tshuva, to bring the community together, to return to God, and we're missing the Rasha, we're missing the evil person, then the prayers are not accepted. Why? Because that pungent, disgusting smelling spice within the Ketoret is a critical component of the whole Ketoret. So much so that if it's missing, the whole thing is invalid. And that teaches us about inclusivity. That even those who you might think should be outside the camp, so to speak, and they're beyond repair, and they stink from sin and from imperfection, they too are part of the community. And we learned that from the 11 different spices in the Ketoret. And here in chapter 11 of Tanya, we're learning about that imperfect spice, that imperfect individual. And let's talk about it. So in the previous two chapters, we talked about tzaddikim. We talked about the completely righteous people, the people who never sin, never will sin, will never even contemplate sin. The question is only, did they convert their animal soul also to get on board or not? Now, to understand what's going on here, we have to understand a principle that the Alter Rebbe laid out in chapter 1 of Tanya, which is that even somebody who violates the most minute, seemingly insignificant violation, even if it's just a rabbinical violation, that person is called a Rasha. Now, conventionally, we understand a Rasha as somebody who does a sinful act. But what we're trying to get to over here is the real core, the real inside of the person. The true description of the Rasha is describing what's going on inside the person. Because just as the word tzaddik describes somebody who does not have an evil inclination, his evil inclination has either been converted or completely deactivated, as opposed to a Beinoni, which we're going to get to in chapter 12. But somebody who does not do any sin and does all the mitzvos, you cannot describe him as a tzaddik necessarily unless he transformed his inner core to deactivate his animal soul and totally desensitize himself to worldly pleasures whatsoever. So somebody who did do that is called a tzaddik. Why? Because of his inner internal state. It's not just externally, does he do sins or does he not do sins? In many cases, as we'll see when we get to chapter 12 and we discuss this in greater length, a Beinoni, the intermediary person, is indistinguishable from a tzaddik, because a Beinoni behaves externally in the same way that a tzaddik behaves, completely perfect. The difference being the Beinoni struggles internally. The tzaddik has already subdued that element of struggle. So since the tzaddik is talking about what's going on inside the person, the Rasha over here is not about, oh, how much you sin. Do you sin a lot? Do you sin a little? Frequently, infrequently? The fact that inside there is a potential for sinning, that's what we're talking about. In that sense, somebody could be called a Rasha. So in other words, why is somebody who violates the most minor rabbinic violation even called a Rasha? It's not because of something he did, but it's because he is primed to sin. So the fact that somebody could sin means that there's something inside of him that's weak. There's a certain weakness in the animal soul, in the godly soul, I'm sorry. And the animal soul has some control over the godly soul. So to clarify this even further, the holy soul, the godly soul, is a piece of God above. Literally, as we said in chapter 2, it's connected to God in every fiber of its being. And since any sin, no matter what level sin, separates a person from godliness, so as far as the godly soul is concerned, it's impossible to violate anything against God's will. Because if I am a piece of God, why would I go against myself? Why would I go and punch myself in the nose? Makes no sense. So the godly soul sees every single sin as a spiritual death. So if the godly soul had its way, it would never sin. So the very fact that a person has a possibility of sinning, and that means the very fact that a person has a possibility of separating themselves, albeit temporarily, from godliness, proves that the animal soul, it has overpowered the godly soul and has control and has a say over the godly soul. So this is why we're calling such a person a Rasha, in the sense that the animal soul has the ability and has successfully weakened the godly soul. So in the control, so generally speaking, a Rasha is defined as someone who the animal soul has control over the godly soul. Now, within that control of the animal soul over the godly soul, there are two general categories, one lower than the next. There's the Rasha v'tayvlai, Rasha v'ralai. The Rasha which good is to him and Rasha which evil is to him. We'll explain what those mean. Similar to the parallel to the tzaddik which good is to him and tzaddik which evil is to him. So let's begin with explaining the level of Rasha v'tayvlai, the Rasha which good is to him. Perek Yud Aleph, chapter 11. Here we go. V'zelu mazeh. Now this, opposite this, Rasha v'tayvlai leumas tzaddik v'ralai. The Rasha v'tayvlai is opposite the tzaddik v'ralai. So as you know, in any playoff sport, the number 1 seed plays the number 8 seed. The number 2 seed plays the number 7 seed. The number 3, the number 6, and the number 4 then plays the number 5 seed, right? So if we only had 3 teams, you have or 5 teams, you have the number 3 seed in the middle, but the number 2 plays the number 4, and the number 1 plays the number 5, right? So the Rasha v'tayvlai, which is the number 4 in the 5 categories, the Rasha which good is to him, is parallel, it's opposite the tzaddik v'ralai, the tzaddik which evil is to him. So every level in holiness has an opposite level in unholiness, in klipa. So opposite the level of the tzaddik v'ralai, which is defined as the godly soul overpowering the animal soul, and the evil within the animal soul is totally subservient and basically deactivated. We also have the Rasha v'tayvlai, that the soul of klipa overpowers the soul of holiness. What does that mean? Dahainu, this means that the good in the person's godly soul, in his mind, and in the right ventricle of the heart is subservient. It is subservient and nullified. It bows down to, so to speak, the evil that comes from klipa, which is on the left side. So we're not saying, oh, what's a Rasha? A Rasha is somebody who eats pork. A Rasha is somebody who speaks lashon hara, who speaks negatively about others. A Rasha is somebody who looks at everybody with a snide side eye. No, we're not talking about what a Rasha does. We're talking about who is a Rasha, what is going on in the spiritual neurology, so to speak, of the Rasha. So the true description of a Rasha is not talking about what he does, but it's talking about what's inside of him. And that is that the power, the evil of the animal soul has overpowered the good of the godly soul, and therefore he is subject and what's the word I'm looking for? Not primed to sin, but he's capable of sin. So when a person is in a situation where he does still have good, but the good within him is subservient to the evil, that's what we call a rush of a taivlai. And that level is opposite the tzaddik virale, because what that means is that the tzaddik virale is someone who still has evil in his left side, but the evil is subservient to the good. So just as the subservience of the evil to the good in the tzaddik virale is not talking about only his actions, because the tzaddik virale, regardless, does not sin in any way. But we're saying that the very matter, the concept of evil in the left side is subservient to the good of the godly soul, to the point that that it's not active, it's not arousing any feelings of taiva, of desire for any worldly matters. And the same is true with the rasha, which good is to him, that the essence of the good in his godly soul, which is on the right side, is subservient to the klipa on the left side, and therefore a person doesn't feel the power of the godly soul as much. And this godly soul, which would otherwise be telling him, hello, how can you do such a thing? How can you ever possibly sin? Is suddenly dormant. And he doesn't hear it as clearly, as loudly, because there's another force that has taken over. Now, to be fair, the level in which the tzaddik virale has subdued the evil is different than the level with which the rush of a taivlai has subdued the good. Because when we're talking about the tzaddik virale, we said that the evil has been effectively deactivated, that it's not felt, it doesn't present itself whatsoever. Because if he would have a desire for good, for evil, I'm sorry, then he wouldn't be in the level of tzaddik at all. We'd call that a Beinani, if he's not actually doing anything wrong. But a rush of a taivlai, we're not saying that all the good has been nullified and deactivated and not felt whatsoever. On the contrary, a rush of a taivlai does feel the good side. And he does study Torah. He does do a lot of mitzvahs. But because the animal soul successfully caused a person to sin even once, even if it's a very minor sin, that shows that there's a certain weakness to the good of the godly soul on the right side, and it now has bowed down to, so to speak. It's become subservient to the evil of the klipa, and that allows sin to not be totally out of the question. And of course, this divides into many thousands, myriads of different levels, in the quantity and the quality of how much the good of the godly soul is becoming subservient and bowing down to, so to speak, the animal soul, God forbid. So the quantity of the subservience, meaning the amount of energy of good that is being spilled over or bent towards the evil, and also the amount of time that the good is being subservient to evil, whether that's frequently or infrequently, and also the intensity with which the good side is being convinced and lulled in by the evil side. There are many levels, within each individual. So he starts with the highest level. There are some people where the subservience and the nullification of the good is very little. So the subservience of the godly soul to the animal soul is only a little bit, and therefore that person, in practice, again, we're describing the essence, but also it comes out in practice that he only does very small sins, so to speak. If you could say such a thing as a small sin, but that's for another topic. And even so, it's not constantly, it's not that he's constantly in a state of sinning, like that's it. You signed up to sin world and now you're just doing this frequently. No, no, it's not consistent. And it's not even often that it happens a lot. But it's rather very disparate times, very far apart. Misgaber hara al where the evil overpowers the good. V'kaivish tza'ir katana hu aguf, and it conquers the little city, the little village. Remember, we said that the body is like a little village that two kings are trying to win a war over. So, in this type of Russia, the subservience of the good to the evil is not only in quality but also in quantity, that it only happens very infrequently. Achloi kulai, but it's not the entire godly soul that's given over. Ela miktsase levad, it's only a little bit. Sheyasar lemeshmaitai, that it listens to its command. Venasale merkava ulevush, and it becomes a chariot and a garment leislabish by echad mishlesh levusha hanal, that to enclose within it one of its three garments. So the small quantity is not only in the amount of time that the godly soul gives into the animal soul, but it's also the amount of limbs of the body that are involved in it. Because this higher level of a rasha, the animal soul is only able to overpower part of the body. In other words, it can't really get the whole person to really get invested and excited fully in the sin. But it could only affect one of the garments. So either it only gets a person to think negative thoughts, or it only gets a person to speak negative things, or it only gets a person to do negative things, right? I remember when I was in yeshiva, there was like a little cholent club, guys who would make a cholent before Shabbos, and it was almost like the sourdough religion, where people are very involved about it and they talk about it all the time. So there was this whole like food club where people were making and talking about all the food, and which is obviously not something that comes from the godly soul, even if it's kosher food. The idea is, being indulged in your eating is just not a godly thing. It's an ungodly thing. It's an animalistic thing. So I remember this line that Mashpia, the spiritual mentor, used to say. He's like, you want to eat good food, fine, also fine. But why do you have to talk about it all the time? Right? Meaning, it's one thing that you invested one of your three garments, the garment of action, into the eating worldly pleasures. But do you also have to talk about it all the time? Maybe you could just leave that alone. Maybe you don't have to invest your power of speech into all that tivus, all those worldly desires that you're involved in. You don't need to talk about it. Do it and move on. So that's what we're talking about over here. We're talking about somebody. It's essentially what the Mashpia is saying is, don't be a lower level Russia, be a higher level Russia. Okay, fine, you're eating and you're enjoying and you love this flavor and that flavor, but stop talking about it all day. Stop investing your power of speech in there too. It's bad enough you have your power of deed in there. So the control of the animal soul over part of the body while you're doing a sin is in a way that the body listens to the commands of the animal soul. That means that it's fulfilling the will of the animal soul in actuality. But not just that, it's actually committing itself and submitting itself to the animal soul and becoming a vehicle and a chariot for the animal soul. The animal soul wants to eat a good steak, and it wants to have it medium rare with certain herbs, etc. But the animal soul is just a soul. It doesn't have a vehicle. It doesn't have a body with which to do that. So what are you doing? You're saying, here, I'm sacrificing my body to my animal soul, that my animal soul will now take control of the wheel and take my body where it wants to go. So even though it's a very minute thing, it's just in speech, it's just in deed, it's just in thought. However, the evil has now overpowered the good. the fact that the animal soul has taken control of my body to any extent, that is the definition of a rasha. So now he goes into more detail about that it's either this way or that way. That means either with only action. It's possible that the animal soul overpowers the godly soul and only it puts itself into the body in actions, meaning actions that don't have premeditated thought or speech. It's just, as we say in Yiddish, a trukin a dry act. A person's not totally immersed in it, in his mind and his contemplation. And even within that action, he's only doing light sins, not very severe ones. Or he's only violating matters of speech, meaning the animal soul has only taken over the power of speech within the body, which is not as severe as actions. We know in the Sanhedrin, in the cases when there was capital punishment, that a person could have been given lashes for certain violations, you can't give somebody lashes for a violation involving speech. Even though you're not allowed to speak negatively, you're not allowed to speak lashon hara, you're not allowed to talk evil about others. However, it's not a prosecutable offense in court. It's still wrong. It still tarnishes our soul, as we're learning here. But that's why he's saying only in speech, meaning not in action. Well, what's an example of speech? L'daber avak lashon hara, to speak the dust of lashon hara, v'leitzanus, or the dust of mockery, uchahai gavna, or things like that. In other words, we're not talking about actually speaking negatively about somebody, but even if it's like, oh, did you see Monica's new Mercedes she recently bought? Now, what's wrong? What did you say something wrong? She did buy a new Mercedes. What's the problem? The problem is implied in that is, how's she spending her money? Maybe she could have done something more useful with it, more godly, this and that. But all of that is avak lashon hara. It's the dust of lashon hara. It's implied lashon hara. It's lashon hara by extension, right? So it might not be the worst thing in the world, right? It's not saying that she stole the Mercedes. She bought it, right? She didn't do anything wrong. But the fact that you're talking about it, there's something implied over there. Why do you feel the need to talk about it? Or it's just in thought. It's possible that the animal soul is able to cause a person to sin only in thought, which is less severe than speech, because the thought stays within the person. It doesn't affect the world around them, and therefore, again, a person can't be punished for a negative thought. So this is just some examples of what it means that somebody could be a rasha, because he has the potential for sin. And even though it might come out in the most minute way, it's very infrequent. A person says a negative word 3 times a year, but even then, the fact that happened shows that there's an ability for that to happen, right? Some people, they don't fly on airplanes. Why don't they fly on airplanes? Because they heard in the news that there was an airplane that crashed 2 years ago, right? But you tell them, what's the big deal? Airplanes are safe. And you're right. Statistically, airplanes are safe. They're certainly much safer than cars. But for whatever reason, this person says, but I saw an airplane that crashed, so I don't want to ever go on an airplane. And to some extent, they're right. Because every single airplane could crash, God forbid. We hope it never happens. But that is possible. And so the fact that it's possible to crash suddenly makes it a threat. So a rasha is not somebody who's crashing airplanes all the time. It's not a company that makes airplanes to crash. A rasha is somebody who can crash the airplane. It's somebody who can sin. And the proof is they've done it 5 years ago, but they still have done it. They've still done something which shows that the evil still has the ability to overpower the good within them. And that's the key point over here. So before we start getting all depressed, oh, the Alter Rebbe said it, like in the school playground. He called me a Russia. He said I'm a bad person. So before we all start getting offended and going to therapy for the Alter Rebbe calling us all Rishayim, we have to realize not so fast. Boeing and Airbus are very reputable companies, and they make great airplanes, and we sit on them and rely on them for transportation all the time. And so Rishayim, as it's described here in Tanya, is not the worst of the worst. We're just talking about people who are subject to sin. And if I can speak for myself, that's most of us people that we interact with on a regular basis. And of course, there's different levels of that, and we're describing that even the highest level, somebody who may sin occasionally in speech or in thought or even in deed, is still within the realm of the general category of Russia, and we'll talk about more details about that and whether thought is actually a problem or not so much of a problem, or maybe worse of a problem than deed. But we'll get into that next time. Mitzvah Shem. Thank you for joining us.